Hi, and welcome everybody to the SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting of March 26th, 2019. Today we have a couple of things on the agenda. First up is SIG leadership. Last week we discussed that Robert Bailey from Google has been assigned other tasks and can't be a SIG lead, co-lead anymore. And we've got a nomination from Justin Santa Barbara to step up instead. Do we have any other nominees? I haven't heard of anyone, my personally at least, but last week or 2 weeks ago we said you could contact either myself or Tim on Slack or announce it in the SIG, some SIG communication channel, whatever. Do we know of any other person?
It's a thankless task.
It feels like Justin is the best candidate for the position.
Okay, going once, going twice, and there we go. Yeah, I also think Justin is an excellent person to pick this up. So I think I'm going to officially write here that Justin Santa Barbara is now our third co-lead. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And with that, you can directly go and start talking about add-ons.
Yes, indeed. So we have the add-on operator KEP, which was has been out for, I guess, a couple of months now. It actually had a surge. I think 2 weeks ago, I think we were basically pretty close to merging it. But it's had a surge of interest from most people working from Red Hat, I'd say. It feels like they are interested in participating, which I think is great news. I haven't got a commitment from them that they're going to do that. So my interpretation is that we should proceed and create a forum for that participation. But I am not sure how we want to proceed. And yeah, I'm not sure what the next steps are.
So let me check. It's targeted at SIG Cluster Lifecycle, right?
It is.
So, I mean, technically, myself, you, and Tim should be like the persons to actually hit the approve label and just get it in. I think. Obviously, if there are loads of outstanding comments, maybe not. But if we have like a general consensus on that this is something we're gonna do, and we write the KEP as, or have the status of the KEP being provisional, I don't see a problem with. Okay, we're not even more at the stage of merge fast because it's been like 2 months, but still, like we could do a merge fast and like iterate afterwards. I'm personally fine with that. What do others think?
I don't know if anyone that commented on the KEP recently is here or has anything they'd like to bring up about it.
Let's see who had the most. Yeah, Tim said 14 days ago, minor comments, then fine to merge as provisional. We have the approved label. It's good. And yeah, then a lot of OpenShift folks. And Brian had also.
I would say there's a meta question, which is, are we going to force people to adopt these add-on operators? And the answer is no, other than by making them so great that, of course, they will want to. And then the other piece was the sort of governance around like who owns the operators. And I think we've always, I feel, been pretty consistent around saying that like the end goal is that the person that develops or the team that develops, say, core DNS would also own the core DNS operator. And we probably have to do some work to get there in terms of creating libraries, toolings, documentation, and probably building a couple of example operators first in a repo we have. But the long-term goal is sort of federation of this. And I think API Machinery had a concern around like, are all of those going to have to be reviewed by API Machinery? And I think the answer is no, they do not have to be, because they would be owned by the respective teams. They probably should get advice, but they don't require.
Especially as long as we build good abstractions, like, what's the phrase? Fall into the pit of success. Make it really easy for people to do the right stuff by default and make it hard for them to accidentally do the wrong stuff. Should reduce the review burden or eliminate it.
Yeah, so I guess like API review on the, like when we establish those first patterns, get input from the API review team and the grounds that then if they like it or dislike it, they can review it once, and then the pit of success will open up for it in that way. I like that. I like that phrase.
Exactly.
And
I did not coin that. I think that was one of the Stack Overflow folks.
Okay.
And another thing is like, if like, say we would tomorrow start iterating on the core DNS operator, then in a separate repo in Kubernetes SIGs, then we would not, in my opinion at least, need API review until we actually try to push that to kubeadm or something like that, or push it to like say push it to the level that it is considered GA, because as core DNS is GA, and if we now want to be the de facto way of running core DNS in a cluster, then obviously we'd need some kind of API review, but like just experimenting with the patterns and what kind of builder kits or add-on kits or whatever we use, operator kit also exists somewhere. While we sort that out, I don't think there's any need for API Machinery. It's like be there and commit.
Yeah, I'd agree. Certainly not a formal review. I think when I bump into them in places, I will ask them for informal reviews because, you know, it's easier to fix things earlier. But
yeah, obviously, yeah. Yeah, it's not that it would be discouraged, but just like not needed on to be like, yeah.
It'll save time in the long run to talk to them early, but yeah, the requirement doesn't necessarily happen even until GA.
Yeah. Doesn't make sense to folks.
I think so.
Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, with the massive amount of comments in this thread, I definitely think we won't ever be so productive that we can sort them out in a GitHub thread ever. So I think that definitely needs to be just a merge now, and then we'll let Daniel and Justin start hosting the meetings, and then we'll just say a pointer that like, look, next Friday, show up here and tell us everything you've got about this, and we'll try to after we know more, we'll update the KEP with the current best practices. Cool.
I have a question to Daniel and Justin. So, as I remember, with KEP doesn't cover kind of like catalog of available operators, so like the way how to distribute those operators. So how the users will be discovering like what they can use in their cluster?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are fortunate here in that we're scoping it to cluster add-ons, and most clusters are installed using a tool. So I would imagine that they would discover the cluster add-ons through like kubeadm or their cluster API or their installation tool of choice.
So the kubeadm will have some static, or we can get something dynamic from, let's say, release infrastructure.
So that, or what we also discussed was like last meeting, like we would have a place in the docs or something that is called SIG cluster lifecycle owned stuff, and maybe like a better name, but that kind of thing. So like here is kubeadm, here is like cops, and here is add-on operator foo, and here is add-on operator bar, and like etc. And then we'll have an aggregated place where people can go and discover, and whenever we need to say that, hi, where are all the things you've built, we can point people at that place for discoverability. And that ties into the other question which Tim talked about, with like the setup guides being extremely outdated. And both of those would be kind of not solved, but in this effort of doing that, we would have to address both.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd also say, yeah, if we can have that shared repository or shared location, I should say, so that like the cops and kubeadm and cluster API and kubespray and everyone doesn't develop their own ones, but rather all reference it. And that's where the bundle format could be an appropriate format for that sort of thing. And it's an orthogonal question, but it's a very closely related question, I think. Like, can we establish some location where we can all basically share the workload there?
Yes, but that's like the fifth cap of this.
Yes. That one will be even more contentious, I imagine. But once again, we will not force anyone. No forcing, just like the pit of success or the pit of the lazy hill, like ride the lazy hill down to the consensus.
Cool. I'm gonna write that unless anyone else have strong opinions against it, I'm gonna write that SIG consensus on merging the cap and merging cap now, and then iterating on it. Cap now as provisional, iterating on it later. Daniel, do you have any updates on the actual logistics of things?
The logistics, things are looking good. We have the repo set up. We have a Slack channel. We have a Zoom meeting set up for the 5th of April. I sent a mail to the mailing list about this. So I think all in all, we're looking good.
So you said, can you please repeat that? Repo setup and link to it in the meeting notes. Zoom meeting, when and where?
Yes. Yes, it's also on the mailing list. Yes. I can add links to the notes. I'll do that.
Yeah. So just we have it recorded in the meeting notes for easy discovery. Great. Any other comments, complaints, concerns about the add-ons effort that now is then official sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle? Cool. Then next up is Andy, talking about cluster API.
Thanks, Lucas. So if you are a member of the Google group, you should have seen a post and a document from me this morning where we are trying to define the requirements and scope for cluster API beyond V1 Alpha 1. And in the agenda doc here, I have a link to the document. There's also a doodle poll for trying to find a time between tomorrow and Friday, so over the next 3 days, where we can have an additional working session or sessions if needed to go over some of the content in the document. We would love for everybody to provide comments and input, and we want this to be a complete collaborative effort. And so we do plan to talk about this at tomorrow's Cluster API meeting and the following one next week. And we are hoping that we can come to agreement on the project scope and requirements by the end of next week. So that's April 5th, I believe. So if you're interested, please check out the document, sign up for the doodle poll if you want to have any additional discussions, and just look forward to everybody's input. Thanks.
Looks like it's back to you, Lucas.
Lucas, you're muted.
Oh, thanks. So my question is more about the next topic, which is release status. So how is Cluster API doing with regards to releases? Do you have a plan for like when the first alpha?
So V1 Alpha 1 is scheduled for this Friday, March 29th. I would like to suggest that we disassociate Cluster API releases from Kubernetes version releases. So it's not really a 1.14 release status, it's Cluster API release status. But the V1 Alpha 1 is due out this Friday, and then anything beyond that is up in the air while we figure out the requirements and scope. And then once we have that, our plan is to use the KEP process for tracking all the work going forward that are the features we're going to be working on. And hopefully through the next few weeks, we'll be able to get a better understanding of what our timelines are going to look like.
Nice. Thanks. And yeah, it has a decoupled release cycle from Kubernetes. Anyone that could talk about Kubedium? Just a like recap of what's been happening with 1.14 release. Any major?
I can briefly talk about Kubedium. So we merged all the PRs and features we wanted to merge, and we also fixed some last-minute bugs related to the new features. The new features are automatic copy of certificates in HA, and the other one is join phases. So we focused on very little this cycle, and we were able to complete it in time. We also, now we have started planning how are we going to do testing for HA and also upgrades and HA upgrades as well. So this is like the priority now. Tim St. Clair is also pushing, fixing the depths and RPMs. And if you're looking at the SIG release channel right now, we have some breakages related to the CNI bump we did recently. But yes, we have already established some of the priorities for the next cycle. For me personally, it's the testing part of things. and getting HA to beta as well.
Cool. What was the CNI bump? I actually haven't heard of that.
So I made a PR in K release to bump CNI to 0.75 because there was a CVE, a security fix, in the Kubernetes CNI package. So the latest patch versions of all the release branches work, but the old patch versions in the release branches suddenly stopped working, as if our pinning to the old CNI is not working in the depths and RPMs. I'm currently talking to a lot of people trying to figure out what's going on and why it started happening right now. But I basically followed the exact same PR as the previous PR that bumped CNI.
Okay, cool, thanks. That's probably infrastructure.
Yes, also we pinged Google folks to show some logs on what they built. Yeah.
Cool. Any other house mini Kubernetes release cycle is tied to Kubernetes? Add that. How about Minikube and COPS, for example? Is there like how many cycles are we behind?
For 1.14, we're releasing Minikube 1.0 this week, which defaults to 1.14.
Okay, cool.
So it's 1.14 works from head right now, but
and COPS is about to release 1.12, so we are a little more conservative. But we're also going to do a 1.13 and 1.14 alpha releases earlier than we have done in the past. That's our big change.
Cool. Do we have any representatives for KubeSpray? Doesn't look like that.
Would be good to get a KubeSpray update because they did have some issues when we went into code freeze.
Yeah, I can try to ping them later, but seemingly no one is here today. Cool. Do we have any other projects that that are tied to the or like ship deliverables related to 1.14? Maybe not. Yeah, then
it's worth mentioning that I saw Ben pushed the kind 1.14 image this morning. So
yeah, we could add that. Oh yeah, like kind is this nice special case where it's like kind of it's belonging to SIG testing, but still like people from here are really passionate about it. I'll write that 1.14 compatible release was pushed this morning. Anything else, or shall we proceed to subprojects, more general status updates? Cool. Lee maybe can. So Lee has started working for WeWorks and will help out in workgroup component standard. to do coding and tracking and that kind of really good stuff. So helping, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we had a great meeting this morning. We currently have a patch for a config serializer that's up, and API machinery needs to get the final stamp of approval on that. It's been in a pretty final state for a while. Now that we have the code thaw through, we're now merging to 1.15 again. So we have 2 patches that are currently pending. Also a global flag refactor to help just dry out some of the code for the kubelet. And then our link to the meeting notes is there. We have a draft of a KEP started just with the globally editable HackMD. If you have opinions about how components should look like, please feel free to add detail to that draft. The link is at the top of the meeting notes. So,
thanks.
Yeah, move on to the Minikube update.
So as I mentioned before, we're doing the 1.0 release this week. It will default to K8s 1.1.4. We have a bunch of other user friendliness patches, including support for changing image repositories from K8s.gcr, which is important for Minikube users in China, for instance. And we'll be slowing development down next week in order to focus on documentation. Basically hosting a fix-it, not just for Minikube's own internal documentation, but for the public documentation on the Kubernetes.io site.
What was that about the users in China?
So GCR is not available in China. So we have a -- image repository flag where you can select a alternative internal or alternative mirror to fetch images from.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you.
Eventually, we would like to make it automatic that if it detects that GCR isn't available, that it'll switch to some vetted set of mirrors. But right now, you have to manually pick your mirror.
Cool. And with regards to COPS, Justin, do we have, I was thinking etcd ADM, do we have time at all to think or do anything about that, or should we, is COPS doing something with it, or?
I've been neglectful. I've been really focused on getting 1.12 out the door and 1.13. Those are the ones where we actually switched to use what will become etcd ADM. We're still using our fork now, just because we haven't had time. But once we get past 1.13, we will then be free to do that. I think one of the things that is unblocked is we can do the etcd2 to etcd3 migration in COPS's fork called etcd manager, and then we don't necessarily have to do it in etcd ADM. Whether we should do that, whether there will be another etcd3 to etcd4, which will also destroy everyone's data, I don't know, but we will see. But I guess should we have that, we can cross that bridge when we come to it, and we have the code in etcd manager, so that would greatly simplify etcd ADM. I'm also inclined to say we should not create the possibility for such a disruptive change.
I'm actually uneducated on this. Are people still running 1.12 with etcd2? Is that a thing?
etcd2 to etcd3, etcd2 and etcd3 have nothing in common other than the 4 letters of their name. They are totally different databases. And so anyone that has been running a cluster that started on etcd2 has had a hard time switching to it. That is what the etcd manager, which will then merge into etcdm, will do, which is let you move the data from etcd2 to etcd3 even when you're running an HA. So yes, for now, but people are doing it. But in Kubernetes 1.13, etcd2 support is removed. So that is our hard deadline for COPS to get people onto etcd3. It's been a long road.
Yeah. So SED2 support was removed. Cool. That makes sense. So where is etcd ADM gonna live more like practically? Do we already have a repo name for that, or in SIGs?
I thought we had a repo. I don't know if Daniel's here. Daniel. Daniel, do we have a repo?
we've got a repo. In fact, we've got already some PRs and things.
I will address my neglectfulness by reviewing those if you would like me to.
Take a look. Yeah, well, I think there's just some outside contributions, actually, just small fixes and flags and things. So people have their eyes on it, and it's like we just need I'm trying to spend more time on it myself. It's moving along slowly but steadily.
Very cool.
Cool. And with regards to that, any other general updates, like with regards to, I don't know, releases, plans, timing? If people want to start contributing to etcd ADM, what do they do and how? And do you have specifics about? Do you have meetings, for example, and that kind of stuff? Just iterate that here. So.
As far as I know, we don't, right, Daniel?
No. Yeah, we don't. So that's something that I guess we need to think about. And we'll probably do something similar to maybe the KubeADM model that seems to be working. Maybe some contributor guidelines and testing. That's one of the things that I'd like to work on soonish. Is have automated testing so that PRs are not something that reviewers have to test manually. So that's
etcd Manager has a relatively good test suite, so I can certainly work on that. It's still running in Travis instead of in Prow, but it's at least a start, I guess. So I can tackle some of that.
Okay. And I think also for etcd ADM, something at least in the CLI right now, there's not there's no configuration. There's no a well-defined API aside from the flags is like the de facto API. So that's something that probably is worth working on because people are asking for more knobs. Adding in the interim, adding more flags, and I suppose since SADM right now is alpha, that we're not bound to those flags, but the sooner that we have an API and a schema that we can sort of iterate on and provide, I guess, some kind of, I don't know. Well, I guess with alpha there are really no stability guarantees, but at least we can iterate on the API number. Alpha 1, Alpha 2, etc.
Yeah, it really sounds like you could join a component standard meeting and get more information there about how to build your component config. So you can get away from, like, flags are good for like minimal things like KubeADM has, but like once you get into something more, then component config is the way to go. Cool. That is a really good status update. Thank you. KubeADM.
Okay, so for KubeADM, like most of the stuff was mentioned by Lubomir already, but the other big thing is that we are currently gathering information on what changes need to be included in the next version of the configuration. We have gathered already some substantial list and a sort of initial mockup, though not all of the proposed changes are into the initial mockup. As of like an hour ago, this list is open for voting, and we'll probably like count the votes either tomorrow on the kubeadm's office hour meetings or on next week's.
Cool, thanks. And with regards to the next release, what are the high priorities? Other than we want beta 2?
Like the config isn't actually a very big priority. The major priorities there are like increasing end-to-end test coverage using Kinder and possibly getting HA to graduate to beta. So these are like the big things. And also the Kubernetes release artifacts.
Right. Great. Yeah, that should be it. Any more updates from anyone? Going once, going twice. And Solly, cluster extension, CRD installation doc.
All right. So as some of you may be aware, there's an effort going on to figure out exactly how we're going to deal with CRDs that are kind of critical to cluster functionality. So or could potentially get in the way of pod launch. So this is stuff like runtime class, for instance, and also some of the volume related things, which could be mounted as a persistent volume and therefore could also get in the way of pod launch. Most of the current examples have been moved into core APIs because we didn't have a good solution for this, but we're trying to figure out a solution. So I put together a document that I shared with SIG Cluster Lifecycle and also SIG Arch, because that's where the effort originally started. And I was asked to come talk about it a little bit at this meeting. So I didn't know if people had specific comments, or you want me to give kind of a summary of my thoughts and then we can go into it from there, or what?
Please do a summary, but also can you link the doc? Surely I have it somewhere, but
yeah, I can do a quick summary. I'm currently on my phone right now.
Oh, right.
If someone else with access to the CRD installation Slack channel could just, it's in there. So if you could, someone could drop it in.
Yeah, I found it.
All right. So the basic gist is that because these extensions could potentially get into the pod creation, are potentially important to the pod startup process, we don't want them, whatever's hosting them, to be in the to depend on the normal pod startup process itself, right? So while CRDs are purely declarative, we could have stuff like conversion webhooks, which will eventually be necessary for some of these APIs, or even validating or mutating webhooks for defaulting or validation logic that need to actually be run as processes. And so I think we need to treat these much the same way that we treat the controller manager or the API server in a typical deployment setup. So my proposal is that we produce a series of static pod manifests and also obviously the CRD YAML, and we say, hey, this is this is one way to install it. This is our kind of canonical install path if you're using a cluster that's managed by a static kubelet, or by a kubelet with static pods. And so you can install these. If you're using an installation tool that doesn't do that, then here's kind of the path that we recommend you take. And so we'd provide these static pod manifests and some sort of add-on manager-y thing that would just reconcile the static pod manifest into the pod manifest directory and make sure that certificates are set up for webhooks and stuff like that. And so, and that would be an option though. Like, we wouldn't require people to do this. This would just be our reference implementation.
Okay, thanks. So questions about that from anyone? So one thing that I wonder is, so if I have something that, or if I have a CRD schema and I want that to get applied to the cluster, will there be an official, like how is that gonna, from the CRD schema, which I suppose is on disk somewhere, how is that gonna bootstrap into the cluster and using what credentials? Because there's something that needs to write to CRDs, have write access to CRDs on the API server. So like, will we have a well-defined path for the kubelet that, like, I don't know, if you're running if you happen to be running a API server also as a static pod, make sure you post this or whatever. Like that sounds weird, but I don't know what kind of thing you thought, or like, will there, because we need to do this with like privileges that make sense, Arbeck.
Yeah, I that's a good point. I should address the RBAC aspects explicitly in the document. I'm assuming that we'll have a user that is basically like the a user that has permissions to create the CRDs, either a CRD bootstrap user or one of the admin users, to have basically, because would be a necessary part of the cluster in this scenario, in some capacity, whether your installation manager is doing it or whether you're using this add-on manager. So we'd have to have something with similar permissions. Does that answer your question, or was that? I'll add something to the doc though, because that's a very good point.
Yeah, so that's one, and then like with regards to the certificates and how they're going to be used, like, do you envision using the CSR API or rolling something, I don't know, random?
I was under the impression that the CSR API was not supposed to be used for serving certificates.
Right. Technically it can, but like with the approval process, but I'm just saying, like, how, let's say there's a user that has their CA key externally somewhere, and like, how would this controller, even this add-on manager, or whatever you call it, how would it even be able to access the CA key then?
So the reference implementation, because we're dealing with things that actually just because we're dealing with things that all have like CA fields, we have kind of two options. So the first is to allow the user, or there's two paths that the user could take. The first is for the user to provide a pre-existing CA and CA key, and we can generate a certificate for that. And the second is we can just generate a self-signed CA to make it easy for the user. Like if you don't have one, we'll generate a self-signed CA. It's really only being used for communication on the loopback adapter in the default deployment topology. So it's not, there's not a whole lot of risk here. And simply because webhooks require HTTPS, at least at the moment, even if they're just kind of running on the loopback adapter or whatever. So we need a certificate authority and serving certificate. But it doesn't necessarily have to be your master one. If your organizational policy dictates that and you still want to use this, you could always supply the CA key, or we could have an option for you to pass in certificates.
Yeah, that makes sense. But one final question, at least, would be that, let's say we have some really, really important out of 3 admission webhook that is needed to do some things with CRD storage, for example. And kind of everybody needs to do this. Do they need to run this as a static pod then on the master, so it can like using like, I'm thinking, as if I understood it correctly right now, the static pods needs to be run on host network because we necessarily don't have a network when we start. So
yes.
And do we need to allocate like a random port that we then for this thing, so that we then can access using localhost via the API server to this admission?
Yeah, that would basically be the default deployment topology. This is kind of matching up with at least a little bit how we currently have our, for instance, if you cluster up on GCP, like for our ATE test or whatever, you get a master with a static, with a kubelet on it, and it launches a bunch of static pods, starting the API server and stuff. So it would be sitting alongside those.
Okay. Right, and that's what we do in KubeADM, and I think most places as well. Like it totally makes sense to use a kubelet as the like babysitter for these containers. But then I assume, so like the admission controller starts up, it somehow's gotta get some client certificate to the API server. Does it register itself then and like say here, like, hi, I'm here, I post the admission webhook CRD or API object, whatever, and tell I'm running on this random port and you should contact me here?
Yeah, the idea would be like the manager, the add-on manager would do the registration there. Not literally the thing that we call add-on manager today, the our reconciler that does the extension management that just kind of sits in a static pod.
Yes, but that's what I'm thinking. Like, do we actually need that kind of manager? Because like that's one more thing, and like then we have the operator and the operator, and then we have like does or is there a way we could just like, I'm thinking like I run a kubelet, I run the control plane components on top of that. Is there a way that I could just drop the manifest or just like curl down it or whatever from case.io and it would just work, or like it would bootstrap its own things from a well-defined library that you would import, obviously, so you don't have to write it yourself? But
generally having things capable of modifying their own registration is not the best idea. From a like separation of concerns. perspective, or like a isolation of permissions perspective rather, it's something that could be doable, but I'm not sure that having the extra thing or just having a part in kubeadm that does it would be so much of an extra burden.
Well, the problem is where, yeah, Justin.
I was just gonna say, like, I think it may be that there's some similar thing for like add-on operators. Like today, an add-on operator has to have the RBAC permissions for the things, the operator itself, because it creates an RBAC role, has to have all the RBAC permissions for the things it is creating, which is again a sort of oddity. And maybe there's something here so that if someone is using add-on operators, we can make that first component richer and address both use cases. But I don't want to blow up the scope too much on add-on operators any more than I already have. I don't see an alternative to what Saldi is suggesting that is any significantly simpler. I don't know if Lucas, you have something particular in mind, like the curl approach.
No, I don't know either, but I'm just thinking like if there's anything, or like if there's, I'm just worried about like that we add, like it's easy. So suddenly we have to have 10 different processes running on every master on the same ports, and they need to coordinate, and then there's like 3-4 extra certs per admission controller and all that kind of stuff. Like it's already a like complex thing as is. I'm just thinking through the cases, if we could simplify it somehow, or if we could build in a small like bootstrapper in the kubelet. Like is that totally, like in the same way as we have the static pod bootstrapper, could we have like register your admission webhooks here or whatever, like put your CRDs here, or like just thinking out loud, but like if we could, yeah.
There's actually some discussion of that already, and if you go to the bottom of the linked document, there's a previously discussed alternatives document that discusses the idea of the built-in bootstrapper in some process. I think that document mainly discusses it from the perspective of having like the controller manager do it, but I think the same concerns apply, or having the API server do it, which is you end up with the kubelet oddly having extra permissions to do stuff that it wouldn't normally be able to do. And you also end up with a solution that isn't really usable as easily or convertible as easily for stuff that doesn't look like a normal Kubernetes cluster. So for instance, if you are one of the folks that's doing like Kubernetes on Kubernetes, you don't necessarily need to run this as a static pod in your management cluster. You can easily convert these into something that just runs a deployment in your management cluster. Or if you are like someone who is trying to use the Kubernetes control plane without kubelets, which we have had people have interest in without like other kubelets, you could convert this solution to run wherever you're running the control plane. Whereas if it's built into the kubelet, you're kind of limited to a certain topology. And while it's definitely still a reference implementation, the ability for that reference implementation to be converted into a usable form with other installation topologies is a useful feature, I think.
Yeah, the suggestion of the controller manager makes a lot more sense to me than the kubelet, since the kubelet is concerned with execution and the controller manager is concerned with making sure control loops have what they need.
The the controller manager has its own set of issues. Among other things, the controller manager, having it in the controller manager means that pods aren't running as static pods, and then you can really easily get yourself into a situation where you bork your cluster by doing something like accidentally setting a mutating admission webhook that injects a runtime class into all of your pods, for example, when runtime class was a CRD. And while this scenario, while the solution there is, okay, just don't do that, that's an easy way to shoot yourself in the foot and get the cluster into an irrecoverable state. So to encourage or to prevent cluster instability like that, I really think it's important that we treat these components as infrastructure components the same way we treat the controller manager itself, for instance.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up and discussing the proposal. We're running out of time now, but so with regards to follow-ups, you're gonna convert this into a cap and do the normal way of executing next?
Yes. Cool. I would like to convert this into a cap. I just wanted to finish gathering some preliminary feedback on the Google Doc, and then I'll try to incorporate that and turn it into a full-on cap.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Time's up for today, and see you next week. Next 2 weeks.
See ya.
Bye.